Black people have been asking the same question for centuries. What did we do to y'all? Like, seriously, what the fuck did we actually do? Because at some point, you have to stop believing that this is random. You stop believing that this is just ignorance. Because how are Black people simultaneously copied, feared, mocked, criminalized, fetishized, segregated, underpaid, over-policed, erased, and exploited on basically every continent on Earth? At some point, you have to realize, oh, this is not about behavior. This is not about morality. It's not even about individual Black folks. This is what Blackness was made to represent in the modern world. And that answer is ugly, because the truth is, Black people became the foundation the modern world built hierarchy on. That's the answer. Not because Black people did something uniquely wrong, not because we're uniquely violent, not because we're uniquely criminal, but because Europe and then the United States needed a permanent bottom caste to justify slavery, colonialism, empire, and capitalism. You can't build an empire on stolen labor without creating a group you can convince the world deserves exploitation. That is what we became. That is what Black people became. The justification, the bottom rung. And once the world built itself around Blackness meaning less than, every other group learned to define themselves in opposition to that, right? That is why anti-Blackness survives, even in places with barely any Black people, because it's not based on personal interaction. It's ideological, structural, inherited. Now, let me show you what I mean when I say everywhere. In China during COVID, Black residents in Wanzhou were forcibly evicted from their apartments, refused service at restaurants, banned from McDonald's, and quarantined separately from everybody else. In 2016, a Chinese laundry detergent commercial showed a Black man shoved in a washing machine and coming back out as a clean, light-skinned Chinese man. That ran on national TV. In India, Black African students have been beaten in the streets, followed by mobs, refused housing. The skin lightening industry itself is worth over $1 billion. Billion with a B. In Russia, when the country invaded the Ukraine in 2022, Black students were pulled off buses at gunpoint by the Ukrainian police to make room for white refugees. In Italy and Spain, Black professional soccer players still have bananas thrown at them on the field. In 2026, in Lebanon and across the Persian Gulf, African and Asian women work as domestic laborers under a system that legally ties them to their employers. What is that called? Yeah. Their passports get taken. They can't leave. Multiple of them have died by suicide, trapped in homes that they just can't escape. In Brazil, police kill more Black people every year than almost any other country on Earth. Now remember, they're a country that's over 56% Black. In Argentina, the Black population was literally erased from the official census for over a century. Whole countries pretending that Blackness doesn't exist within them. The hatred is global. The pattern is identical. It all traces back to the same source code, and it is profitable. The global skin lightening market is worth between $14 and $19 billion per year. The same multinational corporations that publicly supported BLM, they're selling skin bleaching creams in 60 countries to Black and brown women trying to escape Blackness. Also, they can be considered beautiful. L'Oreal, Procter & Gamble, Estee Lauder. Y'all remember Fair and Lovely? I do. After 2020, when global protests called out the racism, they changed the name from Fair and Lovely to Glow and Lovely. And they kept selling it. Same product, same premise, different label. The hatred is profitable. That's part of why it stays. The other part is psychological. If Black people are at the bottom of the global hierarchy, then no matter how badly your group is treated, you can still position yourself above somebody. Anti-Blackness is the bottom rung that holds the whole ladder up. Take it away, and the entire structure has to be rebuilt from scratch. And that's why it doesn't move. Black people are the constant negative reference point every other group on Earth uses to figure out where they stand. And the scary part is you can see how this plays out in everyday life, right? Because when one Black person does something wrong, suddenly all of us become suspects. One Black kid acts up in school. Now Black children are out of control. One Black employee messes up. Now DEI is lowering standards. One Black neighborhood struggles with poverty. Now Blackness itself becomes associated with dysfunction. But when white people commit atrocities, suddenly everybody becomes deeply committed to nuance, mental health, isolation, economic anxiety, a troubled loner. White people get individuality. Black people get collective judgment. That is conditioning. That's centuries of propaganda teaching the world that blackness represents danger, incompetence, aggression, hypersexuality, criminality, laziness. Whatever the society needed blackness to symbolize at that moment, just to justify the unequal treatment. And people absorb those ideas before they even realize they have them. This is why black people have to constantly overperform humanity just to receive baseline grace. You have to be exceptional. We have to be exceptional to get what other people get automatically. And that shit is exhausting. Exhausting. A lot of you all question why I show up the way that I show up because you wouldn't listen if I showed up any other way. And you know it. People in this country love to talk about racism like it's abstract. Slavery was bad. Jim Crow was bad. The civil rights movement happened. And now we're past it, right? That sanitized version is how this hierarchy stays intact. So let me see what was actually done to black people in this country. Trigger warning, it's about to get graphic. Mary Turner. I've told you about her. 8 months pregnant. May 19th, 1918, Lowndes County, Georgia. Her husband had been lynched the day before for a crime he didn't commit. When she said publicly that the men who killed him should face justice, a white mob came for her. They tied her by the ankles, hung her upside down from a tree at Folsom's Bridge, doused her in gasoline and set her on fire, all while she was still alive. They took a butcher's knife and cut her open. Her unborn baby fell to the ground. A man in the mob stomped on the baby's head, and then they shot Mary Turner's body hundreds of times. She's one of at least 3,446 documented black people lynched in this country between 1882 and 1968. And lynchings were not done in secret. They were public events. White families brought picnic baskets. They brought their children. They posed for photographs next to burnt bodies. They cut off body parts and kept them as souvenirs. Fingers, ears, genitals. Sold them in jars at general stores. Postcards of the bodies were mailed through the United States Postal Service. Yeah, the same one that brings you your mail. You could buy a postcard of a black corpse hanging from a tree and send it to your cousin in another state with a note that says, "We had a good day today." This is what was happening in this country in 1918. The same year my great-grandmother was a young woman. The same world my grandma May was about to be born into. Emmett Till, 14 years old. August 1955. A white woman in Mississippi accused him of whistling at her. Decades later, she admitted she made it up. 2 white men dragged this boy out of his uncle's house in the middle of the night. They beat him. They gouged out one of his eyes, shot him in the head, tied a 75-pound cotton gin fan around his neck with barbed wire, threw his body into the Tallahatchie River, and when his body was recovered, his face was so destroyed it was unrecognizable. His mother, Mamie Till, insisted on an open casket. She said, "Let the world see what they did to my son." The men who killed him were acquitted by an all-white jury. A few months later, they sold their confession to a magazine for $4,000. That was 70 years ago. How old is your parent? How old is your grandparent? The violence has not stopped. We know that. So let me bring you a little more current, because that kind of stuff just doesn't happen anymore, does it? Sonia Massey, July 6, 2024. Springfield, Illinois. A 36-year-old black mother of 2 called 911 because she thought there may be a prowler outside her house. 2 sheriff's deputies came inside and she moved a pot of boiling water off her stove. She turned to the deputy. She said, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus." The deputy pulled his gun and yelled, "I'll fucking shoot you in your fucking face." And he shot her in her face in her own kitchen after she called 911 for help. Second-degree murder. He got 20 years, and her mother said at the trial, "Today, I'm afraid to call the police for fear that I might end up like Sonia." Breonna Taylor, 26 years old. March 13th, 2020. Asleep in her own bed in Louisville, Kentucky. Police executed a no-knock warrant on the wrong apartment. They fired 32 shots into her home. 6 of them hit her. She bled out on her hallway floor. The officers that killed her were never charged with her death. That's just some of the names you know, right? There are black women dying in police custody every year, whose names you will never hear. There are black trans women being murdered every year, whose names you will never hear. There are black children being killed by police, whose families will never see a trial. The Washington Post tracks every fatal police shooting in this country. Black Americans are killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans, year after year after year. And right now in 2026, the violence is being expanded. ICE raids are going into black neighborhoods. They're looking for Haitian, African, Afro-Caribbean immigrants and disappearing them into detention. Families ripped apart, children separated from parents, people being deported to countries they'd never lived in. The federal government is rebuilding the infrastructure of racial terror, all under a new name. It's the same playbook, though, just a different uniform. I told you about my grandma May. She's from South Carolina, and she couldn't look white people in the eye. Didn't want to. She could not. Because Black folks from her generation learned that eye contact could get somebody hurt. So even after the laws changed, her body still remembered. That's what racism actually does to people. It settles into the nervous system. My grandma Alice barely talked about what happened to her growing up Black in the South. And honestly, that silence bothers me more now that I'm older. Because I think some Black elders knew if they started talking, the grief would never stop coming out. My mom was a part of the school integration process. She walked into the school and saw the words, "Go home, niggers," on the wall. My mom. And still had to sit down and learn math after all that. My dad grew up hearing stories about the Hells Angels, not the same stories you know. The ones about them rolling through Black neighborhoods, hunting Black people. These were stories that he eventually had to sit down and tell his children, me, about. Then my brother Steven, he's 2 years older than me. Just 2. He was working at a steakhouse when we were in high school. He was a teenager. The Klan came in. He was expected to serve them, smile, refill drinks, pretend everything was normal. And he walked out. He quit. And that story sits in my chest differently because it feels generational, you know? Like something broke right there. Something broke with him. Like generations of forced submission finally collided with someone saying no. That's 3 generations of my family. Miss May lowered her eyes so we wouldn't have to. Miss Alice carried the silence so we wouldn't have to. My mom walked through the slur on the wall so we wouldn't have to. My dad carried the stories so he could tell us about it. Stephen took off the apron and walked out. Each generation gave the next one more permission to lift their head. You get me? A little more freedom, a little more breath, a little more sky. And what scares me is that people think this history is over, but it's not. This country has done the rollback before. After slavery came Reconstruction. For 12 years, from 1865 to 1877, Black Americans have built more political power than they had in the previous 250 years combined, to state legislatures, to the United States Senate. Black children went to school for the first time in this country's history. The federal government cut a deal to resolve a contested presidential election. The Republican Party agreed to pull federal troops and end Reconstruction, and what followed was called redemption. That is the actual historical term. Redemption. White America literally called the destruction of Black political power redemption from Black freedom. It didn't happen all at once, of course. It happened in pieces, over decades, you know. Voting rights stripped state by state. Public schools re-segregated. Federal civil rights enforcement ended. By 1896, the Supreme Court legalized segregation. By 1900, most Black men in the South couldn't vote. By 1910, lynchings in the South were happening at about 3 per week. The country watched all of this happen. The federal government let it happen. The Supreme Court blessed it. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was the second Reconstruction. Executive Order 11246, which LBJ signed, that mandated affirmative action for federal contractors. In 2013, the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. In 2021, the court gutted Section 2. In 2023, the court ended affirmative action in college admissions. In 2025, Donald J. Trump, he revoked Executive Order 11246. The order that was signed in 1965 by LBJ, it was gone in a single signature. He signed executive orders ending DEI in the federal workforce, in the Department of Defense, in the Foreign Service, banning federal contractors from affirmative action, banning federal employers from training on unconscious bias, banning federal schools from teaching about cultural sensitivity, now investigates private companies for DEI policies. The Department of Education now threatens schools that teach Black history. In April, the Supreme Court dealt the final blow to the Voting Rights Act. And almost immediately, Tennessee acted. They moved to split up Memphis, the state's only majority Black congressional district. That speed should terrify people. Protections weaken, and suddenly Black political power, coincidentally, starts disappearing again. This is redemption. A second time. Voting rights weakened. Black districts diluted. DEI attacked. Black history targeted. Affirmative action erased. ICE expanded. And people want Black Americans to act irrational for noticing the patterns, because our family survived the first version of it. So when Black people ask, what the fuck did we do to y'all? Here's the answer. We existed inside a system that needed somebody at the bottom. We existed inside a world that built itself on our own supposed inferiority. We existed inside countries that pretended that we were not real. And the world built an entire global system to punish us for it. We just refused to disappear while you told the world we weren't real. That is the answer. That's the only answer there's ever been. What did we do? Nothing. We existed, and we still do. We're not going anywhere.